Morning, everyone. It's great to be with you again this morning. It's lovely to remember all your faces sitting there in Bethel. So I've been thinking about the idea of waiting and how it comes out pretty strong in the message of scriptures. I guess we come to understand that to mean the idea of trusting and relying on God. And I've wondered for a long time what the opposite of waiting might look like. If I chose not to wait, but went with vigor and intensity in the very opposite direction, what would that be? I think most people would be inclined to agree that it would probably be an over-reliance on our own abilities and resources. In thinking this over, I realized that all my reasoning was quite speculative, lots of probably, maybe, logical deduction, etc., but not much definition. So I've attempted to think about this a bit more carefully and intentionally. I can think of lots of examples of people who trusted in God and would be described as being people who waited or relied on Him. The same is true for examples of people who did their own thing and didn't really rely on God. But if you could only pick one example of each, and that one had to be absolutely definitive, what would your choice be? In other words, what would be your penultimate example of waiting on God? Who defines the category with the ultimate display of this waiting idea from which all others then replicate? And who defines the category for the opposite? Who provides some sort of category defining moment and forever defines the action which is the opposite of waiting? The more I think of it, the ultimate example of waiting has to be provided by Jesus, specifically Jesus in Gethsemane. This is where he carries the greatest burden, where all creation rests on his shoulders, and with a nature that is screaming out to survive and thrive, he has to actively choose to follow God's plan. And in that moment, he provides that ultimate display of trust and reliance, or we might say he waited on God. That is, without doubt, the most important moment in all of human history. That decision and choice right there is the key to everything. It was the ultimate surrender. If we want to think of its equal and opposite sort of counterpart, we need to think about the event that Jesus in that moment took head on and reversed right there. And to keep it nice and neat and simple, the answer is that in that moment Jesus reversed the action of Eve, where she reached out and involved herself in something that she shouldn't have. Now, when we keep it that simple, it's great, because we can say the opposite then of waiting is in fact reaching. You either stay low and humble and surrender, or on the other hand, you self-elevate and proud and ambitious. One is to wait, the other is to reach. So once you see this idea of reaching, you see it everywhere. Ultimately, God shows us the extension of Eve's reach. She, from a human perspective, reached out and took something insignificant, really, as a piece of fruit. But it represented a way of thinking that would result in people banding together and building a tower which would reach to the heavens in the Tower of Babel. So very simply, this idea of reaching is about trying to solve our own problems, to fix our own salvation, to do things our own way. And this is a helpful framework to superimpose over the stories that we know so well, it helps us to identify how the characters in them navigated between the choices of waiting and reaching, and how successful they were at getting it right. So one great example of this is with Abraham and Sarah. And we only have to look at the record where God promises Abraham and Sarah a son. It's not ambiguous at all. It's specific. It's their own son, and it details a lineage, for that matter, without number. And you would think that with that specificity, that they'd be like, great, let's wait to receive this promise. But that's not what happens. Instead, they say, let's rather reach our hands into this and figure out a human solution. Let's help God along with the delivery of this promise. So Sarah says, here, you take my servant Hagar, you impregnate her, it'll be fine. We'll just pretend it's mine. So it helps to have a very clear physical idea of this reaching movement. It's typified by Eve's extension of herself, the reach. So it's the extension of our arm to take and interfere. It's about extending or projecting ourselves into a realm in which we actually shouldn't be imposing ourselves. And God is teaching us that waiting means that we do not imprint our DNA on His provisions. And understanding that really, really, really helps. One of the most fundamental stories in the whole Bible, where God is bringing out the nation of Israel from Egypt. It's a magnificent story with enormous consequences for both sides. Egypt is decimated. There's been huge signs and miracles in the 10 plagues, and then God brings them across the wilderness, the desert, in day and night sort of movement, a long distance, which is a miracle in itself. He says He carried them on eagle's wings. And He brings them to the Red Sea, and there He makes them cross over in dry land, and the Egyptian army is completely obliterated. One of the most powerful nations on earth is decimated. That's the context of this. And you reading the story and seeing these marvelous great events, and in 3 months from the day that they left, they arrive at Mount Sinai, and God brings them out and He says, right, this is where we're going to be joined together in a covenant relationship. And He descends on Mount Sinai, and it's smoke and fire and burning, and it's thunder and lightning, and it's just a magnificent spectacle of things, and nobody's allowed to touch the mountain, and Moses has to go up, and the people of Israel are around about, and they're so scared because it's so magnificent. And God gives them the 10 commandments, and He says, now we're in a relationship, this is how I need you to behave, everything's going to be great. And then literally in the very, very, very next section, God says, because you're going to be living right, from time to time, I'm going to visit you in your life and give you promises, and I'm going to take care of you, and you're going to want to remember those promises. You're going to want to remember those times where you feel my presence in your life and the fact that I've taken care of you, and you're going to want to build altars of remembrance. Now, this is the very next thing. Like, in terms of the order of events, can you see how in the context there's been this huge global uprooting of a nation out of another one, and the destruction of one, and this marriage of God and His people. And this is what God says. He says, you're going to want to make altars of remembrance, and make sure that when you create a remembrance of my provision, like, this is super important, that you use raw stone. You use a boulder, you can take it out the earth, but don't reach out and interfere with it. You can take a rock out of the ground and use it, but don't cut it, don't chisel it, don't make it straight, don't make it sit nicely. Don't reach out and impose your DNA on my provision. If you do, you're no longer remembering my provision, you're remembering your efforts. I created the earth, I created the stones, that's my stone, so it represents my provision. As soon as you put yourself on it by cutting it smooth and doing whatever, it now becomes yours and you're remembering yourself. So now we're talking about a stone of provision which is not cut out by human hands. So this is Jesus again. He's the stone provision provided by God, cut out of a mountain without hands. And so if we go back to Gethsemane, this is where it actually gets super interesting, because it's funny when you read the gospel records from the section which you'll notice is generally titled the betrayal of Jesus. It's like the last 3 or 4 chapters in the gospel, like Matthew 24 to the end, John 18 to the end. If you read that over and over again, you'll find that this pattern or a model emerges. Jesus is, of course, the central figure. And we spoke already about how he made that ultimate reversal of the reach with the ultimate and opposite action of the weight. That this was his decision to surrender to God's will, God's plan. But then it's like God says, okay, so here's the provision, this example of Jesus. And I want you to receive this and align with that example. But to help you do that, I'm also going to show you some examples of those around Jesus at that time, some who did it well and some who did it not so well. So here then God is saying is in tandem with the example of Jesus, the perfect example of Jesus, providing the perfect weight, the perfect surrender. Here also in tandem with that is the spectrum of human attempt that I've selected that shows what's good and what's bad. And this is what it's actually going to look and feel like when you now practice the art of waiting or you enter the realm of reaching. And so to do this, God includes 3 people on the spectrum. These are the 3 key figures whose actions are deeply revealed in the story of the betrayal of Jesus. On the one hand, we have the best example of them all. It was Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene. You know what she did? Jesus said, I need to die to make this work. And she said, okay, I trust you, and I'm going to trust the process. And by faith, Mary Magdalene bought expensive anointing oil. She went up to Jesus in front of everyone else and intimately massaged that oil into the hair of Jesus to prepare his body for burial. She had a life. She wasn't perfect. She sinned. She said bad things. She thought bad thoughts. She was a human. But because of her faith, which caused her to wait, to not try and interfere with God's method, Jesus said that her story will be preached as part of the gospel. And that's significant. It means that by her action, she wears the gold medal for the best interpretation of the weight outside of Jesus. Now, on the other hand, we have the worst example of them. It was Judas Iscariot. You remember what he did? Jesus said, I need to die to make this work. And he said, Well, if that's the case, I'm going to help you along and get things moving. And then when he realized that it was a grave mistake out of zero faith, he took the ultimate step of avoiding responsibility and accountability by ending his life. He had a life. He wasn't perfect. He sinned. He said bad things. He thought bad thoughts. He too was a human. But it's because of his lack of faith which caused him to reach in and meddle in the provision of God's salvation that Jesus said about him, it would have been better for that man to have never been born. That too is significant. Wherever this gospel is preached, Judas Iscariot represents not only the worst possible execution of waiting, but also the best possible example of reaching. So those are the two opposite ends of the spectrum, Mary Magdalene and Judas Iscariot. And in the middle, trying to figure out what to do and where to go, is Peter. And here we receive more context. Not only had Jesus explained to the disciples that he needed to die, but when you read between the lines, you realize that he had also told them that they needed to get out of there. He prays for their safety and he speaks about not having lost any of them. And then he uses his spirit power to knock down the guards that come to arrest him. And this gives them opportunity to run away. John records this in his gospel. And then he ties that together as Jesus actively bringing the prophecy of Jeremiah to fulfillment, where he says that the shepherd is struck and the sheep are scattered. And then the final piece of evidence is that we know that Jesus told them to meet him in Galilee, because after 3 days he'd be alive again and would go there to join them. The inference of all of this is that he was saying, guys, I need to die to make this work and I need to do this alone. It's not safe here for you. God's got this. He's doing this. There is nothing that you can do to add any value to it whatsoever. And if you're in the way, then there is every chance that you'll be in a position where you're going to get hurt. Not a chance, says Peter. Even if you die, I'll die beside you. There's the reach thinking on display. And Jesus says to Peter, you've extended yourself into a realm in which you won't cope. Before the trumpet sounds, not only will you have not died for me, but you will actually have denied you even know me 3 times. Peter, this is God providing for you. Get out and go to Galilee. No ways. I'm better than these guys. I'm sticking by you. And Peter makes good on this. The guards arrive to arrest Jesus. What does Peter do? Peter takes out a sword and he reaches it out to cut the enemies of Jesus to pieces. And Jesus has to reprimand Peter. He says, do you really think that this reaching by you here with your sword is our only way out? Right now, I could reach and get 12 legions of angels to sort this entire planet out. But I've already decided not to reach, but to wait. So later, Jesus would turn and look at Peter, who then goes out and weeps bitterly because he realizes he's not better than all the others. He's caught up in reach thinking instead of a waiting mindset. Later, Jesus would heal Peter in Galilee by making him realize that to wait means to put the sword away and feed the sheep because God has provided everything else already. Now, a couple of things stand out as really helpful to me in all of this. Firstly, the example of Judas is, amongst many things, a warning, I suppose, not to give up. Whatever the previous choices, don't limit God to forgive by taking the opportunity away from him. Secondly, Peter really demonstrates the danger in the deceitfulness of reach thinking, because it is so easy for the evidence of the reach to be masked by good intention. There was nothing malicious about what Peter wanted to do. Yet if he had his way, even with all his good intentions, where would we be today if he had persuaded Jesus to fight and not go through with God's plan? And this concept is true in all cases. Was Eve being malicious? Probably not. God had said we'd be like him one day. Maybe this was a test and we have to find the way on our own. Was the Tower of Babel completely a malicious structure designed to wreak havoc and destruction on the earth? Probably not. But the angels saw down the road and perceived that despite the good intentions of the project, it was a human attempt at a problem only God could solve and would end up harming the God project. Were Abraham and Sarah malicious in sourcing Hagar? Probably not. Just desperate and blinded by the limitations of human understanding. God had promised a son. Maybe this is the way he meant for it to happen. We can't just sit on our hands. God expects us to act. This is a red flag for me. It means that I need to take my decisions and almost pour them into a spiritual beaker and see whether they mix into a solution with God's plan or if they separate like oil and water. Where no matter the fact that my intentions are sound, the fact is that my decisions might not actually align with God's plan and the purpose that he has. Thirdly, and finally, the example of Mary Magdalene is quite astounding. From a human point of view, it was futile. What was the point of such extravagant waste? In fact, to the detractors of Jesus, it gave them cause to be really angry with her and almost make out like her actions were on a scale of such gross negligence that under the conditions in which the occupied country of Israel found itself, that to waste like this was tantamount to malicious and treasonous behavior against the poor who could have actually derived some tangible benefit from the sale of that perfume. Yet from God's point of view, that action stands out as the ultimate replication of waiting like Jesus showed us how to wait. Only when you think deeply about it do you realize that it wasn't Mary arriving at her own conclusions and being deceived by her own good intentions. Behind that action was a spiritual insight founded on surrender and acceptance. Having accepted Jesus' words and surrendered to the fact that he needed to die, instead of being a Satan and getting in the way, she spent an absolute fortune on a gift of encouragement and meaning. She got up close and personal with Jesus. She hugged him and massaged this oil into his hair while she looked at him and said, Jesus, I want to show you how thankful I am for what you're about to do. I mean, I know you're struggling with this and you know I'm powerless to help you, but I just want to tell you that what you're about to do means absolutely everything to me. And I think what God is showing us is that she did help. Jesus commended this action as an action that encouraged him and assisted him in going through with what needed to be done. Mary Magdalene was so aligned with God that her actions are placed side by side with the equivalent actions of God. When she encourages Jesus like this, at the same time, God is also sending angels to strengthen and encourage Jesus, and he gives Jesus that time of encouragement with Moses and Elijah in the Transfiguration. So her actions are positioned as being in alignment with God. So I don't know yet how this will impact or transform my life, but I'm getting the sense that Mary was operating on a plane that no one else really was. She had, she transcended rules and human conformity and boxes and laws and culture. She didn't need all of that. And in a way, it reminds me of a story about Aaron that impressed me. That it was when they began to administer the rules of the law in the wilderness that God had given to Moses. And Aaron's two sons are performing their priestly duties, and they show a lack of care for the rules. And in the story, God kills them straight away. And Aaron faces a parent's worst nightmare and loses two children in one situation, not even to an accident, but by punishment from a God whom he loves. And Aaron is furious with God, and he has an argument with him, and Moses intervenes, I think the story goes, and then as soon as the dust settled, when Aaron, who has recently lost 2 boys to disobedience, himself contravened some rules in the service that he's administering in the priestly duties, and Moses absolutely loses with him. What is wrong with you? Haven't you learned your lesson? And Aaron says, hang on a sec, let me explain. And then he goes on to show a spiritual perception as the basis for his actions, which God accepts. And the law of Moses is actually amended to cater for this wisdom that Aaron has presented. And it shows this transcendence above law to a place of communion and relationship with God. And to me, that is where Mary was. She was in the relationship zone. It wasn't about her good works or good intentions. In fact, I think the real point is that it wasn't about her at all. It was completely about what Jesus needed. And therein lies the point.